The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books Podcast. Michael Tracey is a reporter for TYT Politics and a freelance journalist who has written for Vice, The Nation, Rolling Stone, The Washington Post, The Intercept, and The New Republic. He's also been a skeptic of the Russia collusion story. And on this week's episode of the Zero Books Podcast, we continue our discussion of that narrative and specifically take up the ideas in his piece for The New Republic entitled, Why Are Leftists Letting the Democratic Establishment Define the Trump Opposition? Also in this episode, Tracey discusses a Twitter scandal that followed after Tracey tweeted the following. Rep. Maxine Waters just shoved me and angrily stormed off as I asked her questions. Not a violent shove, but she initiated physical contact. California Congresswoman Maxine Waters did, at the very least, swat away Tracey's hand and microphone as she walked past him. She did so in response to this question.
That protection of our democracy and understanding that Russia is not our friend and that they are undermining our democracy by hacking into our elections and trying to determine, as they have done, who should be president of the United States, and that's very important. At the same time, we fight very hard for health care. We're trying to preserve the ACA while they're trying to undo it with Trump care that's going to throw 34 million people out of health care. And so we know how to do both, and we're doing that.
When you say Russia's not our friend, was Obama mistaken to forge military cooperation with Russia in Syria and to try to get a START treaty?
Look, you and I have a different agenda, young man. I'm out to impeach this president. Get that straight. I'm out to impeach the president. I'm not going to be diverted by people who are Obama haters.
Do you think...
There you go. Go, Maxine!
Okay, there you go. She pushed me aside, but that's okay.
It's Wednesday, June 28th, 2017, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. I want to remind you that Angela Nagle's book, Kill All Normies, and Joanna Dimmer's book, Anatomy of Thought Fiction, are both available through Amazon and other online vendors. I want to encourage you to ask your favorite bookstore or library to carry Zero Books titles. Set some 200 years in the future, Dimmer's Anatomy of Thought Fiction treats a critique of the present, namely Dimmer's own arguments about the connection between popular music, the collapse of liberal arts universities, and the current turn to the right, as a MacGuffin for a kind of meta science fiction. If you enjoy this podcast, consider joining the Zero Books Club. Zero Books Club members receive access to a Saturday podcast entitled Inside Zero Books, which sometimes features the second half of a conversation with Zero Squared guests and sometimes features conversations with Zero Books readers about the state of the left. Zero Books Club members are also invited to participate in YouTube workshops with Zero Books authors and others. The music you're listening to right now is Vitus's hit, The Seventh Element. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Michael Tracey and I discuss how liberals are shoving the Russia narrative.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm going pretty well. Glad to get a chance to talk to you again.
Yeah. Always an interesting discussion, I'm sure. So
yeah. Here's a caveat up front. I don't want to talk about shoving.
Okay, that's fine.
what I thought I'd do is just jump in. I read your article that you sent me in the New Republic.
By the way, I would actually be fine with talking about that because I think the incident and the reaction to it is actually pretty interesting on a number of levels. But yeah, it's not worth dwelling on. But
well, we could talk about it a little bit at the start. I mean, why don't you tell me actually?
I mean, we don't have to. I mean, it's up to you. But
I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. If it's going to shed any light. It looked to me like it was a kind of open and shut case. She shoved your arm to get out of the way. The major thing was she was rude and she wouldn't answer a very reasonable question. That was to me what it was all that came down to. But then the social media reaction maybe deserves its own comment.
I mean, the social media reaction is interesting because there are a lot of people on social media who have pre-existing hostility toward me for a number of reasons, and that's fine. That comes with the territory when you're in the public square and you're making statements that some regard as controversial on a frequent basis. But the incident was interpreted through a certain lens, which kind of automatically assumed that I was kind of the malefactor. In a different context, it's not hard to imagine how that would have been interpreted, right? If a journalist had been at a public event where a member of Congress approached the journalist and agreed to an interview and then got visibly agitated over the course of the interview, and the questions being asked were reasonable and as you acknowledged there, and then the member of Congress initiated some kind of unwarranted physical action against the journalist, and whether it rose to the level of an assault, which I never claimed it did, or whether it was just a shove or a push or whatever word you want to use, then I think in most contexts that would be portrayed in the media and viewed on social media as unacceptable. And that's how I perceived it in the moment. But because I think of just the way that social media operates, it was almost possible to look at the encounter impartially for a lot of people. And I understand that. I think the more important aspect of it is that she is how she, a prominent Democrat with a large national following and somebody who was looked to as I would say maybe a lodestar of kind of progressive sentiment in the country. The fact that she reacted to the question in such a way, I think, is notable and it's worth reporting. But for some reason, it got totally distorted. The Society for Professional Journalists. I think I'm getting that right. But this organization devoted to protecting kind of journalistic freedoms made a comment on it, and hold on, I can just pull it up here. Yeah, the Society of Professional Journalists president Lynn Walsh said that really did look like it was a swat. That said, what if 5 more lawmakers just swat reporters away like that? The more people do it, the more it becomes accepted. We look at the fact that we do live in a country where we do have freedom of the press. That, to me, being able to swat reporters away is not a free press. Okay, so, I mean, people kind of harped on the term that I used, even though I heavily qualified it in tweet after tweet. But there was, you just can't win when there's a preconception about you in the social media sphere. So that's sort of how the story developed. It was sort of bizarre, and like when you're at the center of a social media maelstrom like that. On the one hand, it's obviously sort of disrupting because you have to deal with it as it's unfolding. But the other hand, I found it. I mean, maybe this is reflects my sadism in a way, but I also find it sort of interesting just to observe from a sociological or anthropological standpoint, because these kind of the way that social media functions is increasingly a major factor in people's lives and can have real consequences. So to get a bird's eye view of it, it's sort of illuminating.
Well, okay, a couple of thoughts on what you just said. Not to really push back, but just to throw a little bit more context on here. You can't ignore the role that gender and race played in the encounter. So okay. The fact that she's a woman, a black woman, she's significantly smaller than you. She represents and probably has built her political career on representing the oppressed. All of this sort of mitigates against being particularly concerned about a SWAT. Whereas if you were exactly the same, but it was, a Republican like James Comey, towering above you and swatting you aside, it would have had a whole different, even if the SWAT had been exactly the same, it would have had a different effect in people's minds, I think. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say, but that's just a kind of like a fact. It doesn't say what right or wrong about it.
Well, yeah, no, obviously that's just a fact, and that's going to factor into how people interpret that encounter. But I think, from a journalistic standpoint, it was I regarded her as a member of Congress who was at a public event and therefore available for interviews, and her conduct in public venues is newsworthy and ought to be reported if it reflects badly on her.
What was it about the SWAT? Because I think there is something there. But what was it about the SWAT or the shove, or whatever you want to call it, her pushing you aside physically, but not with strength? What was it about that gesture that was noteworthy, more noteworthy or as noteworthy as the fact that she was refusing to answer your questions? Because I think there was something noteworthy, and the statement from the journalistic society you just quoted kind of gets to it. But could you restate that, what the significance is?
Well, I mean, the significance is that she initiated physical contact over the course of evading questions and extricating herself from an interview setting. And I just don't think that's acceptable conduct for a member of Congress. It doesn't matter who it is. And of course, people are going to view it through a particular racial or gender-oriented lens, and that's just inevitable. But at the same time, it's sort of incumbent on a reporter, if he or she is in that kind of scenario, to faithfully describe what occurred. And the other thing was, I mean, the initiation of physical contact was just superfluous on her part. It wasn't necessary at all. It was done at a peak. And she got, I mean, this sort of plays into the larger Russia kind of narrative, I would say, in that if members of Congress resort to these kinds of expressions of pique when they're asked kind of basic questions about the policy dimensions of the Russia story that's now being pursued as one of the main objectives of the Democratic Party, then that's sort of troubling in its own right. I mean, I think it's a consequence. I mean, I think it's worthy of probing in a serious, sustained way. And if one of the leading exponents of this certain narrative on the Democratic side, reacts in such a way when asked pretty basic questions to kind of get to the kind of interrogate the premises underlying the narrative, and I think that should be seen by anybody as worrying. Yeah.
And it kind of reveals the poverty of her politics in this moment, not overall, but right now as she's confronting Trump. That just one pointed question, pointing out hypocrisy between one administration and the next, or how one administration was treated versus the next, and she gets angry enough to swat you. I mean, that exposes something.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. If I had a number of questions to ask her, and I would have asked her for more, but the one that I was going to ask that I didn't get an opportunity to, obviously, was she has this trope now that she's tweeting and that she referenced actually at that rally that day in Los Angeles about the so-called Kremlin clan. So she uses the phrase Kremlin clan, and clan with a K, obviously, to refer to Trump and his, coterie of associates who are allegedly in hoc to Russia. And, one of the – so that's the trope she's going with, and that's what's being instilled into the, quote-unquote progressive base of the party. And I think, I wanted to ask her, first of all, about, that phraseology, and second of all, given that she includes Julian Assange in the so-called Kremlin clan, did she agree with this prospect that was floated, I think, in April by the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions that Julian Assange could be prosecuted? Because if she believes that description is apt, then presumably she would agree with Jeff Sessions' apparent intent to prosecute Assange. So, I mean, there are so many different layers of this that I think are worth I think kind of necessitate really serious analysis. And when you kind of look under the surface, a lot of Democrats aren't willing to kind of introspect about it, and that's sort of to me that was the most illuminating thing that the encounter revealed.
Yeah, I've lost a number of friends by remaining not exactly loyal, but at least open to WikiLeaks and Assange as a source of information. There are many on the left who just want to throw him under the bus as a Trump secret, Putin puppet and Trump supporter these days. Not just Democrats in office, but people of all sorts on the left. So it's disappointing.
WikiLeaks is publishing information that's in the public interest because it sheds light on powerful factions and reveals information that otherwise wouldn't be published. Then I think it's sort of an imperative that they be acknowledged as such and be, if not appreciated, at least not kind of witlessly demonized, which is what so many Democrats and liberals have fallen into, because WikiLeaks is so intertwined now in the popular imagination with Russia and, by extension, Trump. So I think people find it hard to kind of disentangle now WikiLeaks from that narrative, and it's unfortunate because they have done and continue to do work that is pretty crucial, and that's just yet another byproduct of the kind of the damage that I think this Russia narrative has wrought.
I want to jump in on your piece on the New Republic, in the New Republic. And I just want to start by saying, I was at the Left Forum last weekend, and I'm pretty hard pressed to tell you just what the left is, but your headline is, why are leftists letting the Democratic establishment define the Trump opposition? My question for you is, right off the bat, is how are you defining the left? I mean, when I was at the Left Forum, I would say that there are so many different factions that are it would be very difficult to give one definition of the left. But in the United States right now, I would say the DSA and maybe a few of the associated or closely aligned publications like Jacobin, Current Affairs, and The Baffler represent the most popular faction of a far left in the United States. If you're not going to start with Bernie Sanders. Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about the left, or what are you talking about with the far left?
I think I sort of defined it, maybe only glancingly in the piece, but obviously there's always going to be a generalization here when you're talking about large, multifarious political groupings. But for the purposes of this piece, which is sort of on a narrow aspect of the analysis here, basically how I defined the left was just in the context of segments of the population that are maybe tangentially open to working within the Democratic Party coalition to achieve certain political ends, but are not themselves dyed in the wool committed Democrats who are hostile to the establishment of the Democratic Party, but who maybe for tactical purposes are again open to forging some kind of coalition that includes segments of the Democratic Party kind of infrastructure, whereas I define center left broadly as factions that are more or less comfortable with the status quo of the Democratic Party, which kind of fit comfortably into the establishment of the party, and see that basically its direction under, for example, Hillary Clinton was good enough for them. And again, obviously, there are going to be infinite nuances to apply there to both labels. But just for the purposes of that short piece, that's how I kind of vaguely defined them.
And you even mentioned the DSA in as an example of a group that might be willing to try to associate with the Democrats at times for different purposes, but aren't identified with the Democratic Party. So.
Right. Yeah, I identified them as an example of certain left elements treating these street protests and other activities that have been organized principally by the center left such as the March for Truth on the Russia issue, such as the Women's March, such as the March for Science, and there are other examples. The Democratic Socialists, you'll find populating these events, I think in part because they view them as an opportunity for recruitment and then eventually radicalization of liberals and people who maybe are who are more inclined to associate with the center left. So yes, that was the context about bringing them up.
And one thing that you also said in there was that leftists risk allowing the Russian narrative to become the focus of the resistance. And you mentioned, left theoreticians toil away formulating systemic critiques that go unnoticed. The Russian narrative is becoming the center of the anti-Trump movement. And that kind of hit close to home, as Zero Books is a critical theory imprint, and the podcast focuses on that and on Marxist economics. And I suppose none of any of that has any real influence in activist circles at the moment, which is sort of sad but true. But
yeah, it's all the more sad because this would be a time where you would hope, or you would think, or you would assume that kind of new theory would be sought after, because we just experienced a completely disorienting election campaign. We're living under a presidency that is unlike anything that's come before in history in any number of ways. Therefore, that's really there's kind of like a vacuum in the kind of theoretical realm here that I think could be filled if there was a quote resistance or an opposition that was a little more rational and a little more kind of interested in the structural reasons for the current predicament. But unfortunately, because Trump is there are a number of reasons for why that's not tenable at the moment. But one of them, I think, is because Trump is such a domineering personality or persona, and that he kind of infects so much of our daily consciousness that people can't help but use his persona and their aversion to it as sort of an organizing principle. That's why you have so many, especially liberals and center-left types, viewing impeachment as an end unto itself, just because they're so antagonistic toward Trump as sort of a figure. And again, with some good reason. Obviously, he's a vulgar figure. But I think fixating so much on the individual is not especially conducive to healthy politics, typically. But I think that's sort of the trap that liberals have fallen into, and that's sort of why they are so insistent on pursuing this Russian narrative to its completion, whatever completion might look like, because they view it as the only viable vehicle at this point to actually remove Trump from power. So it's completely dominant in their thinking and their analysis. And the point that I make in the piece is that I've been a critic, obviously, of the way the Democrats have approached this issue and how it's become an obsession for so many liberals, and you might conclude or just infer from that skepticism or criticism that you're better off. If leftists want to be relevant, they should just ignore it. But I think it actually has to be engaged with critically. Otherwise, you again run the risk of letting the analysis fall to liberals. I mean, there are, at this point, because it's been so dominant in the public arena for so long now, there are people have reasonable questions that deserve answers. So if the response of like a left theoretician is to just kind of sneer and kind of derisively just say this isn't worth commenting on, I think you're gonna leave sort of a vacuum there.
In Hegel's theory, he says something like the owl of Minerva always flies at dusk, which means theorists always come along after things have happened, right? And they only get to look at the situation and try to figure it out once everything's ending.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking of an example of that now. I remember Bhaskar Sunkara. I hope I'm not butchering his name. But the editor of Jacobin. I remember once him commenting that like leftists kind of view whenever there's like a big sensation in the media, like Serial, the podcast.
Yeah.
It seems like left, and it's popular among liberals, especially in affluent urbane liberals. It seems like leftists kind of like wait a year or so to watch it, just so they can kind of analyze why it had appeal among liberals.
Right.
And he was pointing to the Serial podcast as an example of that. I don't know if that holds true for other media, but I thought it seemed right to me.
Yeah, I'm gonna wait a year before I watch the new Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Me too.
But okay, so but we should maybe try to avoid that problem, and especially when it comes to politics. So maybe it's okay for Twin Peaks and the Serial podcast, but it's probably a bad idea for the Russian narrative to just wait for it all to blow over and then analyze it. Let's jump in on this a little bit right now. I watched the Comey testimony to Congress, and I was struck by two major revelations. First was that Trump certainly tried to pressure Comey to discontinue the investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. That was the first revelation, which we sort of already knew, but it was confirmed. And then the other one was that Comey was completely confident that Russia tried to interfere with the 2016 election process, but that his confidence was seemingly entirely based on briefings from a private cybersecurity firm called CrowdStrike. And so like CrowdStrike, got it. So by CrowdStrike. And so I just don't, do you think that's warranted? That doesn't seem like Comey's confidence, his utter, secure assertion was warranted. It seemed a little disingenuous to me, really.
Right. So there are many facets. I mean, when people talk about interference, it's a nebulous word. And I think we might have talked about this on a previous podcast, but it can kind of encompass so many different events, and that's part of why it's had utility for people when they talk about this issue, because it's sort of an umbrella term that you could fit many different phenomena under. The briefing that CrowdStrike reportedly or apparently provided to the FBI served as the basis for Comey's certainty as to the culpability for the hack of the Democratic National Committee. So that's just one kind of facet of the interference that's alleged, but that facet alone has been hugely consequential in terms of how people perceive this issue, because the interference narrative kicked into high gear when, as we all know now, WikiLeaks released Democratic emails on the eve of the Democratic convention in July of last year. And to me, it's just astonishing that this aspect of the story hasn't gotten much coverage at all. I mean, Comey confirmed that the FBI, the federal law enforcement agency of the country, never received primary access to the DNC servers that were allegedly hacked. They had to rely on an account provided to them by a private party, CrowdStrike, which is a cybersecurity firm and provides services to a host of governmental and corporate entities. And one of the services they provide is that they provide an analysis when there has been a hack or a breach or an exfiltration of data, and they essentially enter a fiduciary relationship with whoever their client is, and then they kind of do PR on behalf of the client. So almost like a lawyer-client relationship to some degree. And that's who the DNC approached to handle its problems when the servers were allegedly breached in the spring of 2016, reportedly. And it's just amazing because, if the DNC hack is supposed to be so dispositive of the overall Russian interference narrative, then you would want the most corroboration possible that the servers were indeed hacked by some Russian government entity And in order to corroborate that claim, what's usually useful is for there to be some kind of peer review process that can check the findings of the private firm. But what's so interesting is that, once a private firm is contracted to conduct one of these analyses, the information that they draw to render their conclusion becomes proprietary. So their analysis of the origins of the malware, or they can look into the system and kind of determine what precisely was taken and when. I mean, that information is essentially privatized and becomes the sole domain of the firm. And as of now, that remains so. Even Comey said that CrowdStrike didn't share the technical evidence with the FBI. It briefed the FBI. And to me, that is seen as an acceptable standard of proof to serve as the basis for this wider narrative is just pretty incredible. It at least merits discussion and debate, but it's just accepted as a given. Actually, we at TYT reported just this week that at the same time as the DNC was using CrowdStrike to proffer this technical analysis, the FBI had its own contract with CrowdStrike for unspecified computer services. So that just kind of goes to show that there's entanglement between the private sector and the governmental sector that hasn't been, I think, fully elucidated for the public yet, and yet the fruits of that entanglement or relationship are now again serving as the basis for these narratives that have huge geopolitical consequences.
How far does that does the right of private property go when it comes to CrowdStrike? I mean, for instance, if I were to hire them to investigate how my computer was hacked, say, and they were to issue me a briefing which I thought was fraudulent, in other words, which I thought they had just cooked up rather than really determined through real investigation, would I have the right in a court of law to demand to see that data? Or would they be able to rebuff my attempts to look at what they had done as my, even though I was their employer, as my employee, so that's my question. Do you know the answer to that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. The intersection of the law with this, burgeoning industry, I don't think, I think it's still in flux. I'm actually curious now if there are any examples that might actually shed light on whatever precedent may or may not have been set. But I don't know. It just kind of goes to show that there needs to be more public debate about these things at the very least. Yeah,
because it seems to me when you hire a private firm as a consultant or to do this kind of work for you, maybe they're not a consulting firm exactly, but they're a cybersecurity firm. When you hire an outside company to do that and they hold on to all their information and data for themselves, you're setting yourself up to be ripped off. At least the situation seems ripe for that kind of abuse. And so the idea that the U.S. government would rely on a cybersecurity firm to do this work, to do its intelligence work, it seems kind of fundamentally stupid to me. Do you know what extent this is going on? How much U.S. intelligence work is outsourced to private firms?
I would love to know. For our story at TYT, we submitted questions to the FBI about just that, which were not answered. And just to be clear, we don't know exactly what the nature, what services were provided pursuant to that contract that we
with
reported.
The FBI.
With the FBI, right? But we know at least ostensibly what CrowdStrike did for the DNC over the course of its relationship with them, which was to proffer this analysis. And what that runs the risk of doing is that the firm seeks to placate whoever its client is. And if the client has a preferred narrative that they wish to purvey, And I think the firm, given the fiduciary relationship that they're in, would probably be inclined to kind of tailor a narrative to those specifications. And at the time when this hack supposedly occurred, the Democrats were kind of gearing up to run a campaign. The Hillary Clinton campaign was gearing up to run against Trump on the basis that he was overly cozy with Putin, perhaps had nefarious ties with Russia, and in addition, people forget now, but there was a separate FBI investigation to Hillary Clinton's email conduct that was reaching its conclusion at the time. So they had a whole host of reasons why maybe they wanted to bypass the FBI or to at least kind of feed this event into a political narrative that they were trying to stoke. So that's another risk.
So I think it's fair to say, given the source of the information about the DNC hacks, and I think also the Podesta hacks, right, that it remains an open question as to who really was responsible. That we can't say with certainty that it was Russian hackers at this point. I'm not as confident as Comey, in other words.
Well, it right. It remains open to disputation, at least only insofar as we haven't gotten any primary evidence for it. Everything that's been released from, for example, the DNI report that came out in January is still the only primary source document that we had about any of these claims, at least up until a week or so ago when the Intercept report came out, which gave an NSA document. But even that document didn't contain any of the primary source material. And that's what we really need to formulate a conclusion. Everything else so far has been supposition or conjecture on the part of these intelligence agencies. And we know that these intelligence agencies are comprised, in large part, of people who historically had a certain adversarial view of Russia. And that is obviously going to inform their analysis. James Clapper now that he's a private citizen, he's running around talking about how Russians are genetically predisposed to engage in subterfuge, right? So you have to assume that James Clapper's mindset is also, reflected by various other people in the intelligence kind of apparatus. So to take their suppositions at face value, I think is just complete folly.
The recent report from the Intercept about the NSA is a different piece of the puzzle. It's not about the DNC hacks. It's not about emails being released. It's about the possibility that voting machines were improperly accessed by hackers, right? And in that case, the evidence is, there's no primary evidence. It's just a briefing. But at least we assume that the NSA did this intelligence work for themselves and do have that evidence. They weren't just given a briefing by a private security firm, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think it's also worth noting that if you look at the ODNI report from January, the NSA only expressed moderate confidence in its conclusions. I think in order to kind of understand why their confidence was only described as moderate, we would again want to gain access to the primary source material from which they extrapolated conclusions. And I think that just that is worth bearing in mind every step of the way here, because I think there's a tendency on the part of the media and especially on the part of liberals increasingly to simply take government claims at face value, and that's something that they would decry in other contexts. But in this context, that's what they've done. And even the Intercept in that piece, I think in the third paragraph, made very clear that this shouldn't be seen as probative in any sense. It should be seen as giving insight into how the NSA internally views this matter.
Remind me exactly what the claims in that leaked NSA document or documents were. They were not that the voting machines were actually hacked, right? It was like a level or two above that. Is that right?
Right. I mean, they didn't. They said that there was no evidence to believe that anything substantial was actually achieved by these alleged attempted hacks. I mean, and we talk about a hack. I mean, these are the most rudimentary hacks imaginable. They're spear phishing attempts. So you kind of dress up an email, then you send somebody and try to get them to click on it and put in their password. I mean, these are not sophisticated. I mean, if we're talking about like a sophisticated interference attempt on the part of a foreign government, I mean, this would be low on the totem pole in terms of the severity or again sophistication of the hacking. And yet, you know, when this stuff gets reported, rarely is it emphasized that, you know, the level of the hacking that is alleged here is pretty minor. It would be one thing to like, and I don't think people have a good grasp of that. I think when they hear the word hacking or they hear the word interference, they assume a very grandiose and severe endeavor, but really these are just kind of minor hacking attempts here that you would expect happen all day, every day between non-state actors and state actors all across the world.
Yeah, well, have you seen the television show Mr. Robot?
I don't believe so. No, unfortunately, I don't get a lot of pop culture references.
That's a show about hacking. And
okay.
And from watching Mr. Robot, I'm an expert on hacking now.
Hi, this is Sam from Bank of East Security Fraud Department. Unfortunately, I have to inform you that your account's been compromised.
What? What happened?
First, before I can answer any questions, I need to verify some information. Are you still at 306 Hawthorne Avenue?
Yes, apartment 2C.
Great. And your security question, favorite baseball team?
Yankees. I don't remember this being a security
question. And lastly, your pet's name?
Flipper. Who am I speaking to? Can I get your name and number?
With those details plus a dictionary brute force attack, it'll take my program maybe 2 minutes to crack his password.
From watching Mr. Robot, I'm an expert on hacking now, and my understanding is that even the best hacker will use multi-level techniques. You know, sometimes it's easier to hack a system by making a phone call than by attacking the computer. Just because it was a rudimentary hack doesn't mean it wasn't coming from a state actor. It just doesn't mean it was either, and it's not strong evidence. And I say this again with confidence, having watched Mr. Robot. So what would you think would count as really good evidence for Russian interference in the U.S. election?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's always a worthwhile kind of thought exercise to kind of come up with an example that actually would satisfy your criteria here. Thing is, I wouldn't want to use the word interference because that can mean so much. I would want to narrow what's being discussed here to something more tangible and concrete. Because there are even people who talk about interference in terms of online trolls, literally going on Twitter of all places and creating chaos and sowing disinformation. I mean, that is actually regarded as interference for various members of Congress and liberal kind of commentators. And so I mean, I would want to exclude that form of so-called interference in my final kind of judgment here. I think obviously the most egregious and malicious form of this would be if, when you say interfere in the election, I mean, the election is actually what happens on election day when votes are tabulated. So if there were evidence that the tabulation of votes was maliciously altered, then yes, that would be actually interference in the election. But when people say, if you actually kind of like parse the phrase "interfered in the election," I mean, why is it that hacking John Podesta's email or sending a phishing email to his account that he clicks on and then his emails get released. I mean, why is that interfering in the election? It interferes in John Podesta, it harms Hillary Clinton perhaps, but the idea that it interferes in the election, I think, is just a rhetorical overstatement. I mean, when did John Podesta's email account become synonymous with like the American state or U.S. institutions broadly?
Well, I think laws would have been broken there, right? And if you could find out that the Russian state had broken laws and in an attempt to create propaganda to influence the U.S. election, I think there would be some remedy or another there, legally or otherwise, would be in order. But whether or not it would raise the level of actual interference in the election, I'm sort of with you on that. This is put into the context often. Like I saw a piece in The Atlantic as I was researching to talk to you, which had an interview with a guy named Arkady Ostrovsky. I think that's how you say it. And he claimed that there's been a long-term project dating back to the Soviet Union that aimed at undermining the integrity of the U.S. and undermining confidence in the U.S. both domestically and internationally, and that what happened in the 2016 election might be a part of that long-term project, which Putin restarted once our relations with Russia started to fall apart. But all of that doesn't really... If all of that's true, that seems like sort of normal foreign policy. It's like old Cold War foreign policy reheated. And it's not.
Yeah. So if it is true, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but if it is true that these endeavors go back to the Soviet days, then that would be an admission that this is sort of just typical statecraft, right? I mean, it would be an admission that whatever might or might not have happened in 2016 is not this kind of event, self-contained event that was especially kind of unique. And which is how Democrats have tried to frame it, but it's really just kind of in keeping with how states interact with one another over the course of history. And actually, that what you just mentioned there kind of highlights another reason why I think this fixation has been so insidious, is that Russian interference gets portrayed as intending to highlight divisions in American society, intending to sow discord in the American populace, to kind of amplify fissures in the body politic, and to create kind of discord. And I think now when you get, so I think all of those things very, very obviously, it couldn't be more obvious. All those things exist in American society, totally notwithstanding Russian interference, but because those things can now be attributed to Russian interference, I think it gives people in the institutions that are increasingly discredited in American society an excuse to kind of deflect their culpability for that discrediting and to say, oh, this is just kind of the result of a malevolent intervention on the part of Russia who want to kind of undermine our way of life. And I think that, and that kind of like analytical lens, I think, is destructive on any number of levels.
I think, having watched RT over several years, I think that there really was an effort from Russia today, at least, to highlight fissures in American culture and American politics. I mean, they went out. RT was one of the few places that if you were an American dissident of any political stripe, you could find a platform. They had Rick Wolf on. They had Richard Spencer on well before the last election, When you went on there as an American dissident, you always sort of knew that it was a calculation, that just because these people were providing you with a platform didn't mean that you were really politically aligned, and that you knew that their reasons for wanting your ideas to be heard were not the same as your own. Right? So, like, for instance, if you're an American dissident, you don't want to destroy American society. You want to make it better. You don't want to weaken the U.S. state so another state can push it around. you want to change the society so it's a more equitable place, for instance. Russia had its own agenda, you had yours, and that's just sort of the way politics are played. Just maybe decide not to go on RT, but none of that changes whether or not there are fissures in U.S. society.
Right. And I think that the fact that RT was one of the very few places or outlets where dissidents could be given a platform is an indictment of the broader media environment. So, I mean, the fissures should be amplified when they legitimately reflect on some kind of underlying issue that needs, illumination for the broader public. And the fact that it fell to RT to be a venue where that was possible, I think is just kind of, again, an indictment in its own right. I appeared on RT. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in our previous discussion, but I was invited to appear on RT to discuss the 2012 Republican primaries for whatever reason, and they never dictated to me what I should or should not say. It was just a normal interview, and any television network that you appear on or any other form of media, they have a set of calculations that they use, whether they be profit-based or whether, in the case of, for example, CNN or the Washington Post, if they want to kind of, give a voice to the political establishment, that's one set of calculations that might be operative. Fox News has its own set of calculations, and MSNBC does. So, I mean, that's always something you have to bear in mind when you appear on media. So, yeah, was it in the RT editorial ethos to kind of play to fringe so-called elements of American society? Sure, I think that's pretty indisputable, but I don't see what I think there ought to have been more American coverage of those issues. I mean, you had everybody, Chris Hedges has had a show on RT. You've had everybody from Glenn Greenwald to a variety of appearing with frequency. So I mean, but again, now it's sort of toxic to do so. But I can think back to 2011, 12, 13, when it was pretty standard for people with a dissident viewpoint to appear on that show or on that network. And now to get that framed as like you were sort of a stooge for some kind of propaganda effort is just sort of ridiculous.
Yeah, although, there's also, I think, some cases, and I won't name names or anything, but I've seen some evidence here and there of fringe left groups being invited to Moscow. I've seen, to influence the left's view on, say, the situation in Ukraine, to push a certain kind of anti-imperialist line that happens to help the Russian state. It might even be true, it may not, but so, it's not like these games don't go on even on a level above just inviting people onto a television network. They do, but all of that's just sort of statecraft, and none of that, like, okay, let's say I'm part of Socialists in Portland, Oregon of today. That's the organization I'm in, and I'm invited to Moscow by someone I am talking to, and I fly to Moscow and I attend a conference and I listen to lectures and something in my hotel's paid for, and I leave and I go home and I write newspaper articles for my own internal journal. None of that is illegal. None of that is outside the bounds of what should go on in a free society, right? So, I mean, but that's like the worst I could think of that has happened.
Yeah.
But not to me. I didn't actually do that. But I.
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of wonder. I remember somebody telling me a few years ago that this was somebody who worked for a high-profile media organization, and the person was telling me that that she, along with a bunch of colleagues, had been invited to go to China on just sort of a fact-finding trip. I mean, it was a program where they would invite kind of foreign journalists to come visit China for 10 days or something. And when you're there, obviously you're cognizant of the fact that the Chinese government or whatever specific entity was in charge of overseeing the trip, they are kind of managing the parameters of your experience. So you take that into consideration when you're on the trip. But nevertheless, I mean, nothing is being foisted upon you. You're not being coerced in any way. You're able to kind of come to your own conclusions about various things. And obviously, the broad aim of the Chinese government would be that you come away with conclusions that are sort of favorable to them. But at the same time, you're left to your own devices. And it wouldn't shock me in the slightest that Russia is doing similar things, especially because of the history of Russian state behavior being so distorted in the United States. You'd expect them to even be a little more overt in their attempts to kind of invite or to kind of put forth their own preferred narrative. But again, like you mentioned, that's just basic statecraft. And for now that to be called interference, to me, it's just sort of an unwarranted leap.
But nonetheless, all of this is having a pretty profound impact on the Democratic rank and file these days. That's what you discovered, right? Do you think conversations like the one we're having would in any way make a dent in that narrative?
I think you always have to be hopeful that rational discussion, or what you attempt to do, you have to be hopeful that rational discussion can have an impact on people who are fundamentally fair-minded. I think a lot of the hysteria that's been whipped up is attributable to the media rancor right now, and also attributable to Trump, again, being such a dominant figure. That aversion to him as a persona is being adopted as the sort of organizing impetus for large swaths of the country. And I don't begrudge anybody for that. I mean, I think if you're consuming a certain media diet and you have a certain style of living, that's a sort of a sensible approach. But at the same time, I think it is necessary to talk about this in a way that, again, really kind of probes the underlying premises. And we just attempted to do that here. And I think these conversations could continue because this is not going away. It was pretty evident that it was not going to be going away for a long time now. And I think it has to be addressed head on. At the same time, it is disquieting when you go to a nationwide day of protest, as I did on June, what was that, 2nd or 3rd? And that's being organized by these center-left entities that have affiliations with the Democratic Party, and their reason for protesting is that they want to demand truth on Russia, and this is what is bringing people out into the streets. So I think that has to be it has to be acknowledged that this truly is a priority among not just the Democratic elite or the liberal elite, which is where I think this originated as a priority, but now because it's been so ubiquitous in the media for so long now, it has trickled down into what you might call the grassroots. So as and it's been implanted and kind of ingrained in their consciousnesses. And I think that has to be acknowledged and reckoned with if there is to be a proper response.
Final question here, and then I'll let you maybe proffer a final comment or a question, ask yourself a question. But do you think that this, as bad as it is, as irrational as it is it doing Trump political damage? I mean, if we're going to be just completely opportunistic in our thinking, is this helping to box Trump in and stop him from getting some pretty awful legislation through?
Yeah, that's the thing. There is sort of a conundrum here. I do think that the emphasis on this issue has successfully stymied Trump. If only because he can't focus on other policy initiatives or priorities, because every day there's another kind of like, supposedly earth-shattering development on the Russia front. So, from a pure, if your sole goal is to hamper Trump's ability to govern, then I think it makes some degree of sense to keep hammering away at this topic. And so that kind of creates some sort of distorted incentives.
You have to start weighing. I mean, you have to figure out what you think is ethical and what the consequences would be to play a short game like that. I mean, it could hinder him for a while, but what will the long-term consequences be of brewing up this Russia hysteria? Yes, I mean,
one such consequence is that it's caused Democrats and liberals to venerate these unnamed intelligence community bureaucrats who are constantly leaking things on Trump. And seldom do these leaks actually include any primary source material, the Intercept story from this past week being one exception. But most of the time, what we get are characterizations from these intelligence bureaucrats or select quotes here and there. And basically what has happened is, and there was a great piece on this in Harper's by Michael Glennon, I think, in May. What's happening is that you're basically ceding to unelected, democratically unaccountable intelligence actors the ability to hold an enormous sway over public discourse. And what's happened is Democrats and liberals are cheering it because it has short-term adverse effects on Trump. And that's just one example of how, the long-term implications of this might outweigh the short-term considerations. But I think, it is worth acknowledging that if you have constant and congressional investigations, if you have Republicans increasingly saying that they are troubled by elements of this, if you have these constant leaks and the constant web of Russian quote-unquote ties expanding constantly, yes, it has hindered Trump. It has and even creating an aura of scandal around Trump, even if it's difficult to locate the precise locus of what the scandal actually is. I mean, I think that is just going to have the effect of fatiguing people, and they'll just assume reasonably enough that Trump has done something wrong, which he probably has. Whether it has to do with Russia or not is up for debate.
Yeah, right. I mean, the whole thing about Trump is I don't have any doubt that he has economic ties to foreign governments or in foreign lands that are, represent a conflict of interest, not just in Russia, but probably even more profoundly in Saudi Arabia. So, I don't trust Trump to do anything right or not to be really extremely corrupt. But I just don't. The Russian narrative is, as we've gone over, it's not very convincing. There's not a lot of good evidence around it.
Yeah, he has a worldwide real estate empire. He's a casino magnate. I mean, there are plenty of lines of inquiry for people who want to kind of find some corrupt activity here, and yet the overwhelming focus is on Russia, as if any Russian connections are themselves inherently sinister. I don't understand why, the fact that we have a president now who is engaged in these business entanglements the world over isn't enough for people who want to unearth corruption. Instead, we have to kind of contend with this whole Russia thing. It's just sort of amazing.
It's because it's the intelligence community leading it, is why, I think. And
yes.
They have their own foreign policy agenda that go along with boxing in Trump. It's probably not all about Trump, actually. And that's the scary thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, listen, do you have any questions that you wish I had asked that I didn't get a chance to? Or?
I don't know. I think, there's always more to say about this topic, which is why it's so compelling. I mean, one reason I wrote that piece is because the issue now is so expansive and so dominant that I think it really warrants, again, serious scrutiny. And I think that the hold that this has taken on segments of the political and media class is really worth, again, assessing. One of the responses that I get online constantly when I talk about various aspects of this is that, if you're so keen for people not to get swept up into this hysteria, why are you talking about it so much? You should talk about other things. And to that, I normally reply with something along the lines of, well, yeah, I guess I prefer to talk about other things, but this is still pretty darn interesting, and it's pretty darn kind of up front and center in the national discussion. So the idea that just ignoring it is going to in any way be salutary, I think, is just sort of a fool's errand.